My business partner of 15 years tried to steal everything, but he didn't know what my wife had been collecting. I spent 15 years building something with a man I considered my brother, and in one afternoon, I watched him try to burn it all down. I'm a 47-year-old man, and I co-founded a consulting firm with my best friend Derek right out of college. We started with nothing. I remember us working out of my basement apartment, making cold calls until midnight, splitting a pizza because neither of us could afford our own. We built that company client by client, year by year, until we had over 40 employees and brought in several million annually. I handled operations and client relationships. Derek handled finances and contracts. We trusted each other completely. I never once looked over his shoulder because I didn't think I needed to. 3 months ago, I started noticing strange things. Clients I had personally managed for years were suddenly requesting to work with Derek exclusively. Employees who reported to me were being moved to different projects without my input. When I asked Derek about it, he told me he was just trying to balance the workload. He said I seemed stressed and he wanted to take some things off my plate. I believed him. Then last month, my assistant Rachel pulled me aside after a meeting. She looked nervous. She told me she had accidentally been copied on an email chain that wasn't meant for her. The emails were between Derek and 3 of our biggest clients. In them, Derek was telling them that I was planning to retire and that he would be taking over full ownership of the firm. He assured them the transition would be smooth and that all their contracts would transfer to his new entity. His new entity. I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. I went home that night and told my wife, Connie, everything. She listened quietly, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she got up from the couch and walked to our bedroom. She came back holding a folder that was at least 2 inches thick. She set it down in front of me and said she had something to tell me. For the past 8 months, Connie had been collecting things. It started when she ran into Derek's wife, Angela, at a hair salon. Angela made a comment about how excited she was for Derek's fresh start and how they were already looking at office spaces downtown. Connie didn't say anything at the time, but she came home and started paying attention. She printed emails Derek had sent to vendors announcing his new company. She screenshotted messages between Angela and a real estate agent about commercial leases. She even found a filing with the state showing Derek had registered a new business using a name almost identical to ours, dated 6 months ago. My wife had been building a case against my best friend while I was too blind to see what was happening right in front of me. The next morning, I walked into our office like nothing was wrong. I sat through our weekly leadership meeting and watched Derek talk about quarterly goals and company culture. I watched him shake hands with the employees whose paychecks I had signed for years. Then I asked him to step into the conference room. I closed the door and placed the folder on the table. I told him I knew everything. I told him I knew about the new company, the client emails, the conversations with vendors. I watched his face change from confusion to realization to something I had never seen from him before. He didn't deny it. He leaned back in his chair and told me I had gotten too comfortable. He said I had been coasting for years while he did the real work. He said the clients liked him better, the employees respected him more, and the company would be better off without me. He told me I should just walk away quietly and let him buy me out for whatever he decided was fair. I asked him what made him think he had any leverage here. He smiled and said, because his name was on every contract. His signature was on the bank accounts. His lawyer had already reviewed everything, and according to him, I had no legal standing to stop the transition. He told me I could fight it if I wanted, but by the time anything went to court, the clients would be gone and there would be nothing left to fight over. I sat there looking at this man I had known for over 2 decades. The man who stood next to me at my wedding. The man whose children call me uncle. And I realized I never knew him at all. I didn't say another word. I stood up, took the folder, and walked out of the conference room. Derek called after me, asking where I was going. I didn't answer. What Derek doesn't know is that my wife didn't just collect documents. She also found something in those emails that changes everything. Something that Derek clearly forgot he ever put in writing. Something that his lawyer definitely hasn't seen. I have a meeting tomorrow morning with my own attorney, and by the end of the week, Derek is going to learn exactly what happens when you try to destroy a man who has nothing left to lose. Gerard's office sat on the 3rd floor of a downtown building with tall windows that let in too much morning light. I handed him the folder across his mahogany desk and watched his eyes move across the first page. He flipped to the 2nd page, then the 3rd, his expression staying neutral and professional like lawyers do. Then he hit page 7 and his eyebrows went up. He kept reading, turning pages faster now, and I could see his jaw get tighter with each new document. He stopped on a printout of an email chain and read it 3 times. Then he looked up at me with something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "This changes everything," he said. "Your partner's legal position just collapsed." He turned the email around so I could read it again. I'd already seen it when Connie showed me the folder, but Gerard wanted me to understand what it meant in legal terms. The email was from Derek to a vendor named Mitchell Supply, dated 6 months ago. Derek had written that he was planning to transition the business to his sole ownership and needed Mitchell to set up duplicate invoicing systems that could be switched over when the time came. He'd put it right there in writing, his whole plan laid out in corporate email that could be tracked and verified. "This isn't a partnership dispute anymore," Gerard said. "This is documented evidence of planned fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Your partner's lawyer definitely hasn't seen this, or they never would have let him threaten you yesterday." We spent the next 3 hours going through every piece of evidence in Connie's folder. Gerard made notes on a yellow legal pad, marking certain documents with red tabs. His partner Veronica came in after the first hour, a sharp woman in her 50s who handled contract analysis. She pulled out every agreement Derek had signed over the past year and started checking signature requirements. I sat there drinking bad office coffee while they worked, feeling like I was watching my whole professional life get dissected on a conference table. Veronica found something in the third contract she reviewed. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a clause near the bottom of page 4. "This vendor agreement requires both partners' signatures for any modifications or transfers. Derek signed it alone 3 months ago when he tried to redirect their billing." She found 5 more contracts with the same problem. Derek's name being on documents didn't give him the power he'd claimed. Several of our biggest agreements actually required both of us to sign for anything to be valid. His lawyer had either missed this, or Derek had lied about it, and either way it meant his whole takeover plan had a giant hole in it. "He can't transfer these clients even if he wants to," Gerard said. "The contracts won't allow it without your signature." I drove home that afternoon feeling something change inside my chest. The shock and hurt from yesterday were still there, sitting heavy in my stomach, but something else was building on top of them. Something colder and harder that felt like determination. Derek had spent months planning to destroy me, thinking he was smarter and better positioned. But he'd forgotten about the paper trail. He'd gotten arrogant and sloppy, and now that sloppiness was going to cost him everything. Connie met me at the front door before I could even get my keys out. She must have been watching for my car. I pulled her into a long hug right there in the doorway, holding on longer than usual because I needed her to know what she'd done. "You saved everything," I told her. "Everything we built. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening." She pulled back and looked at me with wet eyes. "I was scared you'd think I was crazy, following Angela around, printing emails, collecting all that stuff. You were protecting us while I was being blind." Gerard filed the emergency injunction first thing the next morning. I didn't go to the office. I stayed home and waited while Gerard's legal assistant delivered the court papers to Derek at work and to the bank that held our business accounts. The injunction froze everything. Derek couldn't transfer money, couldn't move clients, couldn't touch any company assets until a judge sorted through the evidence. Gerard had attached the smoking gun email and 12 other documents from Connie's folder that showed Derek's systematic plan to steal the company. My phone rang at 6 a.m. the morning after Derek got served. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee. I saw Derek's name on the screen and almost didn't answer, but I wanted to hear what he'd say now that his plan was falling apart. "How could you do this to me?" Derek's voice came through the phone loud enough that Connie could hear it from across the kitchen. "Freezing the accounts? Filing injunctions? I'm your partner." I let him yell for about 30 seconds, his words blending together into angry noise. Then I spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. "You did this to yourself when you decided to steal from your partner. Talk to your lawyer. Mine has documentation of everything." I hung up before he could respond. My hand was shaking, but I felt good about keeping my voice steady. Connie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I called an all-hands meeting at the office that afternoon. All 40 employees packed into our main conference room, standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. I could see the worry on their faces. They knew something was wrong. Some of them had probably heard rumors already. "There's a serious partnership dispute between Derek and me that will be resolved through legal channels," I said. "I'm being honest with you. There will be uncertainty ahead. But I'm fighting to preserve this company and your jobs. I need your patience while this plays out." The room stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then someone in the back asked if they should be looking for other work. I told them I hoped they wouldn't, but I understood if they needed to protect themselves. I answered questions for 20 minutes, trying to be as honest as I could without getting into legal details Gerard had told me to keep private. After everyone filed out, Bruce Cowart stayed behind. He was my senior operations manager, had been with the company for 8 years. He closed the conference room door and sat down across from me. "I'm with you completely," he said. "Most of the team feels the same way. We know you built this place." Then he told me something that made my stomach hurt. Derek had been making weird comments about new opportunities to several employees over the past month, asking them if they'd be interested in working for a startup, feeling out their loyalty without saying anything direct. It all made sickening sense now. Derek hadn't just been planning to steal the company. He'd been planning to steal the employees, too. Rachel came to Gerard's office 2 days later to give a sworn statement. I met her there because Gerard wanted me present while she described how she'd discovered the client poaching emails. She looked nervous, her hands shaking a little as she signed the papers. "I'm scared of what Derek might do," she admitted. "Retaliation or something." "You'll be protected no matter what happens," I promised her. "You did the right thing bringing this to me." Her statement added another layer of evidence to our case. Gerard said every piece helped build the picture of Derek's systematic fraud. It wasn't just one email or one mistake. It was months of deliberate planning to take everything. 3 days after the injunction went through, Derek's lawyer contacted Gerard trying to negotiate. I was at home when Gerard called to tell me about it. "Their position is weak," Gerard said. "They clearly didn't know about the smoking gun email until we filed it. Now they're scrambling." "What did you tell them?" "That we're not interested in negotiation until Derek acknowledges his attempted fraud in writing and agrees to dissolution terms favorable to you. The ball's in their court now." I hung up and looked out the kitchen window at our backyard. 15 years of friendship and partnership, and it had come down to lawyers negotiating terms. Derek had tried to take everything, but he'd forgotten that paper trails don't lie and that my wife was smarter than both of us. I spent the next morning making calls. My office door stayed closed while I went through the client list, starting with the ones I'd worked with longest. Each conversation followed the same basic pattern. I explained there was a partnership issue being resolved through legal channels. I assured them the company remained stable and their projects would continue without problems. Most clients listened and said they understood, but I could hear something underneath their words. Worry about whether we could actually deliver during all this chaos. Concern about whether their accounts might get caught in whatever mess Derek and I were creating. A few asked direct questions about what happened. I kept my answers vague, saying only that we had different views on company direction and were working it out professionally. Professional was the word I used over and over, like saying it enough times would make it true. Sebastian called me back 20 minutes after we hung up. He didn't wait for me to say hello before he started talking. Derek had contacted him 2 days earlier, trying to convince him to move his business to the new company. Sebastian told me he'd listened to Derek's whole pitch about fresh leadership and better service, then told Derek exactly where he could stick his new company. Loyalty mattered, Sebastian said. 10 years of working together meant something. He wasn't going anywhere. My throat got tight listening to him. I managed to thank him and tell him how much I appreciated his trust, but after we hung up, I had to sit there for a minute just breathing. One client staying felt like a life raft in the middle of everything falling apart. Penelope's call went differently. She picked up on the second ring, and I could tell from her voice she'd been expecting me to contact her. I started my explanation about the partnership dispute and company stability, but she cut me off halfway through. She'd already signed with Derek's new entity. Her projects couldn't afford any disruption, and Derek had promised her everything would transfer smoothly. She was professional about it, apologizing for the short notice and saying it wasn't personal, just business. I told her I understood even though my stomach felt like someone had punched it. 7 figures of annual revenue gone because Derek got to her first. After I hung up, I pulled up her account details and stared at the numbers, trying to process what losing her actually meant for our bottom line. It wasn't enough to sink us, but it hurt. 2 weeks crawled by with legal motions and client calls and trying to keep normal business operations running. I was in my office reviewing a project proposal when Rachel knocked and told me security needed me in the lobby. I got there to find Derek arguing with the front desk guard. He was demanding access to the financial records room. The guard was explaining calmly that Mr. Mitchell wasn't authorized to enter the building per the court injunction. Derek saw me and his whole face changed. The anger in his eyes made him look like a stranger. He started toward me, but the guard stepped between us. Derek pointed at me over the guard's shoulder and said I couldn't keep him from his own company. I stayed quiet while the guard asked Derek to leave or he'd call the police. Derek stared at me for another few seconds, and I realized the person I'd known for 15 years was completely gone. Whoever this was, whatever Derek had become, I didn't recognize him at all. He finally turned and walked out, but the hatred in that stare stayed with me the rest of the day. The accountant called me into a conference room that afternoon. She'd been going through old statements like Gerard asked and found something weird. Small transfers had been moving out of our operating accounts for the past 4 months. Nothing huge, amounts between 2,000 and 5,000 that wouldn't set off any automatic alerts. But they added up. She showed me the statements with the transfers highlighted. They all went to accounts I'd never heard of. I called Gerard immediately, and he said to send him everything. This was another layer of documented fraud he could add to our case. Another piece of evidence that Derek had been systematically stealing while I trusted him. I thanked the accountant and sat there looking at the highlighted numbers, feeling sick. That night, Connie and I had our first real fight since this started. We were in the kitchen after dinner and she asked how I was doing. I told her the truth. I wasn't sleeping. I kept lying awake, replaying 15 years of friendship, looking for the signs I missed. Trying to figure out when Derek stopped being my partner and started planning to destroy me. Connie's face got tight, and she said I needed to stop doing this to myself. I needed to focus on winning the fight instead of torturing myself about the past. Her voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. I asked why she was getting mad at me when Derek was the one who did this. She said she wasn't mad. She was frustrated watching me hurt and not being able to fix it. We stood there in the kitchen, not looking at each other for a minute. Then she came over and put her arms around me, and I held on to her like she was the only solid thing left in my world. Gerard called the next morning saying he'd scheduled depositions for next month. Derek's lawyer immediately filed a motion to delay. Gerard wasn't surprised. He said it was a sign they knew their position was weak. Every day Derek stalled actually cost him leverage because our evidence kept getting stronger. We were building toward either settlement or court, and Gerard thought Derek would crack before we got to trial. The legal bills alone would force him to negotiate. I asked what happened if Derek didn't crack. Gerard said then we'd go to court and win, but it would take longer and cost more. I told him to do whatever he needed to do. Money didn't matter anymore. Winning did. 3 employees came to my office over the next week. Each one said basically the same thing. The uncertainty was too much. The hostile environment made it impossible to focus on work. They were resigning. I understood, even though it hurt. They had families and bills and couldn't wait around hoping the company survived whatever Derek and I were doing to each other. Bruce took over redistributing their work while I tried to keep morale up among everyone who stayed. I held another meeting explaining we were making progress with the legal case. Things would stabilize soon. People nodded, but I could see the worry on their faces. They were all wondering if they should start looking for other jobs, too. Connie's phone rang while we were having breakfast. She looked at the screen and showed me the name. Angela. Connie answered and listened for a minute, then said she'd meet Angela for coffee, but she was bringing someone with her. After she hung up, I asked who she was bringing. She said Gerard's partner. We couldn't trust anything connected to Derek anymore, even his wife crying about not knowing how bad things had gotten. The meeting happened 2 days later at a coffee shop downtown. Connie told me about it that night. Angela had cried through the whole conversation, saying she didn't know Derek had taken things this far. Connie didn't believe her. She'd heard Angela talking about Derek's plans months ago at that hair salon. Angela was either lying now, or she'd known all along and was trying to cover herself. Either way, Connie wasn't interested in her excuses. The letter came in my office mail. Thick envelope with Derek's parents' return address. I opened it and read 2 pages asking me to be reasonable, reminding me about our long friendship, suggesting I was overreacting to normal business disagreements. They wanted me to remember all the good times, all the years Derek and I had built something together. I sat there reading their words and feeling nothing but tired. I wrote back that night. Told them their son had committed documented fraud. Explained I was protecting what I'd built and had every legal right to do so. Said I was sorry they couldn't see what Derek had actually done. Their response came a week later. They defended Derek and said I was being vindictive. That told me everything I needed to know about where Derek learned his values. Some people would defend their family no matter what evidence you showed them. I filed both letters away and didn't respond again. Gerard's IT specialist called me into a small conference room where he had Derek's old computer set up with multiple screens showing recovered files. He walked me through the deleted emails systematically, pointing at dates and recipients while explaining how Derek had tried to wipe everything, but failed to understand that deletion doesn't mean erasure. The first email was dated 8 months back, addressed to someone named Mitchell at a business consulting firm. Derek wrote about wanting to remove my partner from daily operations and position myself as the sole decision-maker before clients even knew what was happening. My hands went cold reading those words. The IT specialist scrolled down and showed me another email from 7 months ago where Derek discussed taking full control and asked Mitchell about the legal steps needed to push out a co-founder. There were dozens of these messages, each one showing Derek's planning in detail that made me sick. He had researched everything from client retention strategies to how to legally freeze me out of bank accounts. The specialist printed copies of every recovered email and added them to our evidence file while I sat there trying to process that Derek had been plotting this for almost a year. Sebastian called my cell phone 2 days later, asking if I could meet him for lunch downtown. I almost said no because I was drowning in legal prep work, but something in his voice made me agree. We met at a restaurant near his office, and he got straight to business after we ordered. He told me he'd been talking about my situation with 2 other business owners he knew, people who ran companies that could use our consulting services. They had heard about the partnership dispute through industry connections and were impressed that I was fighting back instead of just walking away. Sebastian said both owners wanted to meet with me about potential contracts, nothing huge but solid mid-sized projects that would help offset some of what we were losing. I thanked him and meant it deeply, telling him that integrity seemed like a rare thing lately. He shook his head and said integrity was exactly why he was helping, because he'd watched me handle difficult client situations over 10 years and never once saw me take shortcuts or lie to make things easier. The meeting reminded me that not everyone in business was like Derek, that some people still valued honesty and loyalty over quick profits. Caitlin knocked on my office door late on a Thursday afternoon and asked if she could talk to me privately. She looked uncomfortable as she closed the door and sat down across from my desk. She started by apologizing for not coming forward sooner, then explained that Derek had been asking her strange questions for months. He wanted to know my schedule in detail, which clients I was meeting with and when, what projects I was personally overseeing. At the time, she thought Derek was just being thorough as a partner, making sure he understood company operations. Now she realized he was gathering intelligence about my work patterns and client relationships to plan his takeover. Caitlin said Derek had also asked her inappropriate questions about my stress levels and whether I'd mentioned anything about retirement or stepping back. She felt terrible for not seeing the red flags and wanted me to know she would testify about these conversations if needed. I told her she couldn't have known what Derek was really doing, that he had fooled everyone, including me. Her information got added to our legal file as more evidence of Derek's systematic planning. 4 weeks into fighting this battle, I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep per night and consuming enough coffee to fuel a small city. Every day was a cycle of managing client concerns, reassuring employees, reviewing legal documents with Gerard, and trying to keep the business operational while half my brain was consumed with rage at Derek's betrayal. I would wake up at 5 a.m. already thinking about the next legal motion or which client might defect next. Connie found me at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, sitting at our kitchen table with old photo albums spread out in front of me. The pictures showed Derek and me in our 20s, grinning in that basement apartment where we started everything. There were photos from our first big client signing, from company holiday parties, from the day we moved into our current office building. I was torturing myself trying to figure out when Derek had changed, at what exact moment he decided I was expendable. Connie sat down next to me and gently closed the albums. She said I needed to grieve the friendship and accept that it was gone, but I couldn't let that grief destroy me or distract me from winning this fight. She took the photos and put them away in a closet, then made me promise to get at least 6 hours of sleep. I tried to argue, but she was right. The man in those photos didn't exist anymore, and mourning him wouldn't change what I had to do now. Gerard called on a Friday morning with news that made me sit up straight in my office chair. Derek's new company was struggling badly because he didn't actually have the skills to run client projects without me. Derek understood finances and contracts, but he'd never handled the operational side of consulting work, never managed the day-to-day details of keeping clients satisfied and projects on track. Several clients who had initially defected to Derek's company were now quietly reaching out to our remaining staff asking about coming back. Gerard said his contacts in the industry confirmed that Derek was missing deadlines and delivering subpar work because he was trying to do everything himself. Part of me felt satisfaction hearing this, proof that Derek's arrogance about being the better partner was completely wrong. But mostly I felt frustrated at the unnecessary damage. These clients could have stayed with us from the beginning if Derek hadn't lied to them about my supposed retirement. Now they were caught in the middle of a mess that hurt their businesses too, and even if they came back, the relationships would never be the same. The mediator assigned to our case was a woman in her 60s who specialized in business partnership disputes. She scheduled a meeting at a neutral office location where Gerard and I sat on one side of a conference table while Derek and his lawyer sat on the other. Derek wouldn't look at me during the entire session. The mediator laid out a proposed settlement where Derek would walk away with a buyout for his partnership stake and keep his new company, while I would retain full ownership of our original firm. She explained the financial terms, which involved me paying Derek a lump sum based on company valuation. The number she suggested made my jaw clench because it was far too generous given what Derek had tried to steal. He would walk away with millions for attempting fraud, while I would be left paying him for the privilege of keeping what I'd built. I told the mediator immediately that I was rejecting the offer. Gerard supported my position and explained that any settlement needed to reflect Derek's documented wrongdoing and breach of fiduciary duty. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that the offer was fair market value, but Gerard shut that down by pointing out that Derek's actions had damaged the company's value significantly. The mediation session ended with no agreement and the mediator looking frustrated at both sides. A business journal ran a story the following week with the headline about a partnership dispute at a local consulting firm. The article didn't name Derek or me specifically, but anyone in our industry would know exactly who they were talking about. The piece painted both of us as equally responsible for the conflict, suggesting it was a simple disagreement between partners who couldn't work together anymore. It made no mention of fraud or attempted theft or any of the actual facts. I knew immediately that Derek's lawyer had leaked the story as a way to control the narrative and make Derek look less guilty. Gerard responded within hours with a carefully worded statement to the same journal. He didn't name Derek, but emphasized that our firm was dealing with documented fraud and breach of fiduciary duty by a former partner, and that we had substantial evidence supporting our legal position. The statement let readers draw their own conclusions about who was really at fault. Several clients called me after reading both pieces asking for the real story, and I gave them honest answers about what Derek had done without violating any legal restrictions on what I could discuss publicly. I was reviewing vendor contracts in my office when I discovered something that made me immediately call Gerard. Derek had been contacting our vendors over the past week, trying to redirect existing contracts to his new company. He'd told several suppliers that the partnership was dissolving and they should start billing his company instead of ours for ongoing services. This was a direct violation of the court injunction that prohibited Derek from interfering with company operations or assets. I forwarded Gerard all the emails and documentation showing Derek's contact with vendors. Gerard filed a motion for contempt of court that same day, and we got a hearing scheduled within 48 hours because judges take injunction violations seriously. At the hearing, Derek's lawyer tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, that Derek was just trying to set up his own vendor relationships for his new company. The judge didn't buy it and issued a stern warning that any further violations would result in financial sanctions and possible jail time for contempt. Watching Derek's face go pale at the mention of jail time was the first moment I'd seen him look genuinely scared since this whole thing started. Bruce came to my office on a Monday morning and closed the door behind him with an expression that told me the news wasn't good. He said 6 more employees were considering leaving because the stress and uncertainty were becoming too much for them to handle. They had families and mortgages and couldn't keep working somewhere that might not exist in 6 months. I asked Bruce to set up individual meetings with each person so I could talk to them directly. Over the next 2 days, I met with all 6 employees separately and gave them the same honest conversation. I explained that yes, things were difficult right now, but I was fighting for the company's future and their jobs with everything I had. I showed them some of the evidence we had against Derek to prove we were going to win this legal battle. I acknowledged their fears were valid, but asked them to trust me for a few more months while we resolved things. 4 of the 6 decided to stay after those conversations. 2 still chose to leave, and I understood even though it hurt. I thanked them for their years of service and gave them strong references because their decision to protect their families was reasonable, even if the timing was terrible for us. Connie and I celebrated our anniversary at home on a quiet Wednesday evening because I couldn't handle being in a restaurant where people might recognize me and want to talk about the partnership dispute. She cooked my favorite meal, and we ate at our dining room table with candles and good wine like we were at a fancy restaurant. After dinner, she took my hand and told me she was proud of how I was handling everything, that she knew this was destroying me inside, but I was still showing up every day to fight for what we'd built. She said we survived this crisis because we were real partners in everything, not just our marriage, and that was something Derek never understood. I realized sitting there that I'd been so focused on the legal battle that I hadn't been including Connie enough in actual business decisions. She had proven during this whole nightmare that she had better strategic instincts than I did, and going forward, I needed to treat her like the business partner she'd become, instead of just my wife who happened to help out. We spent the rest of the evening talking about how we'd restructure things once Derek was gone, what changes we'd make to prevent anyone from ever having this much control over our lives again. The next morning, I was pouring coffee in the kitchen when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a professional voice introduce herself as the manager from our business bank. She said there had been unusual activity on one of our accounts overnight, and she wanted to verify it with me before taking action. My stomach dropped because I knew what was coming. She explained that someone had attempted to access a frozen account using authorization codes that were no longer valid, and the system had flagged it as suspicious activity. She asked if I had authorized anyone to try accessing those accounts. I told her no, absolutely not, and asked if she could tell me who made the attempt. There was a pause before she said the login credentials belonged to Derek's employee access, which should have been disabled per the court injunction. I thanked her for calling and asked her to document everything, then I immediately called Gerard. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him what happened. He let out a long breath and said this was exactly the kind of desperate move he'd been expecting from Derek. He explained that attempting to access frozen accounts was a direct violation of the court order, and it gave us another piece of evidence showing Derek's willingness to ignore legal boundaries. Gerard said he'd file a motion to add this violation to our case, and it would strengthen our position significantly because it demonstrated Derek's poor judgment and disregard for the law. I hung up feeling a mix of satisfaction that we had more ammunition and disgust that Derek was still trying to manipulate the situation, even after everything that had happened. 3 days later, I was at the grocery store picking up things for dinner when I turned down the cereal aisle and saw Angela standing there comparing boxes. She looked up and our eyes met, and I watched her face go through several emotions before settling on something that looked like guilt. I started to turn my cart around to avoid the interaction, but she called my name and walked toward me. She stopped a few feet away and said she knew I probably didn't want to talk to her, but she needed to say something. I didn't respond, just stood there waiting. She said she was sorry about everything that happened, and she wanted me to know she didn't understand how far Derek had taken things until it was too late. She said Derek had promised her they'd be set for life if his plan worked, that we'd finally have the financial security they'd always wanted, and she believed him because she trusted her husband. Her voice cracked a little when she said that last part. I looked at this woman I'd known for years, who used to come to our holiday parties, whose kids played with our neighbors' children at summer barbecues. I told her I felt sorry for her being married to someone who'd betray his best friend for money. I said I hoped she'd think about what kind of person does that and what it meant about her husband's character. Then I pushed my cart past her without waiting for a response because I didn't have anything else to say to her. Gerard called me at the office the following Tuesday and said he had news about a settlement offer. I closed my office door and sat down, bracing myself. He explained that Derek's lawyer had sent over a new proposal that was significantly better than their first attempt. This one acknowledged Derek's wrongdoing in writing and offered a reasonable buyout figure for his partnership stake based on a fair valuation of the company. Gerard walked me through the numbers, and they were much closer to what we'd been asking for, though still not quite there. I asked him what changed, and he said Derek's legal position had gotten weaker with each violation and piece of evidence we uncovered. The bank account attempt was the final straw that convinced Derek's lawyer they couldn't win in court. Gerard said we were getting close to resolution, and this was a serious offer worth considering. I told him I wasn't ready to accept yet because the number still didn't reflect the full damage Derek caused to the business, to employee morale, to client relationships. Gerard said he understood but reminded me that dragging this out much longer would cost us more in legal fees and lost business opportunities. He suggested we counter with a number slightly higher than their offer and see if they'd meet us in the middle. I agreed to think about it over the weekend. That same week, 2 major clients who had defected to Derek's company called asking to return. The first call came on Wednesday afternoon from a company we'd worked with for 6 years before Derek convinced them to follow him. The CEO said they'd given Derek's operation a fair chance, but he couldn't deliver on his promises without my operational knowledge and client management skills. He asked if we'd be willing to take them back. I told him yes, but under new contract terms that included stronger provisions protecting us from future disputes and clearly defining our responsibilities. The conversation was professional and businesslike, but it lacked the warmth and easy rapport we'd had before Derek's betrayal damaged that relationship. The second call came Friday morning from another longtime client with a similar story. They'd signed with Derek expecting the same level of service they'd always received, but Derek was struggling to manage projects without the operational systems I'd built over 15 years. I agreed to bring them back on the same conditions as the first client, new contracts with better protections. Both conversations left me feeling vindicated that Derek couldn't actually run the business without me, but also sad that these relationships had been damaged by his actions and would never quite be the same. The following Monday was particularly brutal with back-to-back meetings about employee concerns and tense negotiations with clients who were still deciding whether to stay. By 4 p.m, I was exhausted and overwhelmed, and I felt something crack inside me. I closed my office door and sat at my desk with my head in my hands, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I just broke down. I wasn't crying exactly, but I couldn't catch my breath and my chest felt tight, and I couldn't stop thinking about how unfair this whole situation was. That's when Bruce knocked and came in without waiting for an answer. He took one look at me and closed the door behind him, then sat down in the chair across from my desk. He didn't say anything for a minute, just let me pull myself together. Then he told me he'd been through something similar years ago with his own business partner who tried to push him out of a company they'd built together. He said he spent months consumed by anger and betrayal, replaying every moment looking for signs he'd missed. He said what finally helped him survive was focusing on what he could control rather than dwelling on the betrayal itself. He couldn't control his partner's choices or character, but he could control his own response and his commitment to doing things right. Bruce said the business eventually recovered and he moved on, but the lesson about controlling what you can control stayed with him. I thanked him for sharing that because it helped more than any generic encouragement would have. After he left, I sat there thinking about his advice and realized I'd been so focused on Derek's betrayal that I was losing sight of what I could actually influence. That evening, Connie suggested we take a weekend away from everything to reset and reconnect. I immediately said no because there was too much work to do, and I couldn't afford to be unreachable right now. She looked at me with that expression that meant she wasn't asking, she was telling. She said I'd been running myself into the ground for weeks, and if I didn't take a break, I was going to burn out completely. She'd already booked a cabin 2 hours away for the upcoming weekend and arranged for Bruce to handle anything urgent that came up. I started to argue, but she cut me off and said this wasn't negotiable. I needed this, whether I wanted to admit it or not. So that Friday afternoon, we drove to a small cabin in the woods with no cell service and no internet. For the first 6 hours, I was anxious and kept reaching for my phone before remembering it wouldn't work anyway. But gradually, I started to relax into the quiet. We cooked meals together, took long walks through the trees, and talked about things that had nothing to do with Derek or the business. On Saturday night, we sat on the porch watching the sunset, and Connie took my hand and said she was worried about me. She said I'd been so consumed by the fight that I was losing sight of what really mattered, which was us and our life together beyond the business. She reminded me that we'd survived this no matter what happened with the company because we had each other. I realized sitting there that she was right. I'd been treating the business battle like it was the only thing that mattered, when actually my marriage and my health and my sanity were more important than winning against Derek. Monday morning, I was back in the office feeling more clear-headed than I had in weeks when Gerard called. He said Derek's lawyer had contacted him over the weekend ready to settle on our terms. Gerard explained that Derek's new company was failing because he couldn't manage operations and client relationships the way I could. His legal bills were mounting into six figures, and the contempt violations had convinced his lawyer they couldn't win in court. Derek was finally ready to accept defeat and walk away on our terms, rather than drag this out any longer. Gerard said we could probably push for even more now that Derek was desperate, but he recommended we take the deal and move forward, because continuing to fight would cost us time and money we could better spend rebuilding. I asked Gerard what the final numbers looked like, and he walked me through a settlement that would buy out Derek's partnership stake at a fair, but not generous valuation. Derek would have to sign non-compete agreements preventing him from working in our industry for 3 years, and most importantly, he'd have to publicly acknowledge his breach of fiduciary duty in the settlement documents. I told Gerard to move forward with finalizing the terms. The settlement negotiations took 3 intense days where Gerard and Derek's lawyer hammered out every single detail of Derek's exit from the company. I sat in on most of the discussions and watched as they argued over buyout calculations, non-compete restrictions, and the exact wording of Derek's acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Derek's lawyer tried to soften the language around the breach of fiduciary duty, but Gerard held firm that it needed to be explicit and documented. They went back and forth on the non-compete terms, with Derek's lawyer arguing 3 years was too restrictive, but we wouldn't budge because we needed protection from Derek trying this again with another company. The financial terms took the longest to finalize because every asset and liability had to be accounted for and valued. By the 3rd day, everyone was exhausted and frustrated, but we finally reached an agreement that both sides could accept. The buyout was fair, but not generous, exactly what Derek deserved given what he'd tried to do. The non-compete agreements were ironclad and would prevent him from poaching our clients or competing against us. And the settlement documents included clear language acknowledging that Derek had breached his fiduciary duty to the partnership and attempted to fraudulently transfer company assets. The settlement signing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in a conference room at Gerard's office. I arrived early and sat waiting while Gerard's assistant brought in coffee and set up the documents. Then Derek walked in with his lawyer, and we were in the same room together for the first time since that confrontation in our office weeks ago. He wouldn't make eye contact with me, just stared at the table while his lawyer reviewed the paperwork. We sat there in uncomfortable silence while the lawyers confirmed everything was in order. When it was time to sign, I watched Derek pick up the pen with a hand that shook slightly. He signed his name on page after page without looking up. When he finished, I tried to ask him why he did this, why he threw away 15 years of friendship and partnership for money and ego. He muttered something about deserving more credit and feeling undervalued, that he'd been carrying the business for years while I got equal recognition. His words were quiet and bitter, and they didn't come close to justifying what he'd done to our friendship and our business. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to say to him. The settlement was finalized that afternoon, and Derek was officially out of the company after 15 years of partnership. I signed the last document and watched Gerard's assistant notarize everything, making it legal and binding. And Derek left the conference room without saying goodbye, and I never saw him again. I sat there after he was gone, feeling relief that the legal battle was finally over, but also profound sadness because I'd won the fight, but lost someone I considered family. There was no victory celebration, no sense of triumph, just exhaustion and grief for the friendship that died and the partnership that ended in betrayal. Gerard shook my hand and congratulated me on the outcome, saying we'd achieved everything we set out to accomplish. But driving home that evening, I felt empty rather than victorious, because winning meant losing Derek, and no amount of legal success could change the fact that my best friend of 20 years had tried to destroy me and everything we built together. The next morning, I stood in front of our conference room filled with every employee who remained at the company. I'd sent the meeting invite late the night before with a subject line that just said, "Company Update," and I could see the nervous faces staring back at me, wondering if this was going to be good news or the final blow. I took a breath and told them the partnership dispute was officially resolved and Derek was out of the company for good. The tension that had been hanging over the office for weeks seemed to lift all at once, and I watched shoulders relax and people start whispering to each other with relief visible on their faces. I explained that we'd reached a settlement that protected the company and their jobs, and that we were moving forward without Derek starting immediately. Bruce started clapping from the back of the room, and within seconds everyone joined in, and I had to fight back unexpected emotion at their support. After the meeting ended, several employees came up to shake my hand and thank me for fighting to keep the company alive and preserve their jobs. A junior analyst told me she'd been updating her resume every night, terrified she'd lose her health insurance, and knowing I'd protected that made the whole nightmare feel slightly less pointless. Rachel stayed behind after everyone else filtered out, and I asked her to close the conference room door because I had something important to discuss. I told Rachel I was promoting her to senior operations manager effective immediately in recognition of her courage in exposing Derek's scheme when she could have stayed silent and kept her head down. She looked shocked and asked if I was serious, and I told her that integrity like hers was exactly what I wanted in company leadership, and I meant every single word. Her eyes filled with tears, and she tried to thank me, but I stopped her and said she'd earned this position by doing the right thing when it mattered most, and that kind of character was worth more than any technical skill. We spent the next hour discussing her new responsibilities and the team she'd be managing, and I could see her shift from emotional to focused as she started thinking about the work ahead. When she left my office, she was walking taller than I'd ever seen, and I felt good about something for the first time in weeks. Bruce and I spent the following weeks completely restructuring operations to cover all the functions Derek had handled, and it was exhausting work that often kept us at the office until midnight. We brought in a new CFO named Jennifer, who came highly recommended, and spent her first week doing a complete audit of our financial systems to identify any other problems Derek might have left behind. Jennifer found 2 more hidden accounts with small amounts of money that Derek had been siphoning off, and while the amounts weren't huge, each discovery felt like another punch to the gut. We updated every single financial control and created new approval processes that required multiple signatures and oversight, so no one person could ever have the kind of access Derek had abused. Bruce and I divided up Derek's client relationships and project management duties, and I was working longer hours than I had in years, but it felt necessary to prove we could function without him. The new systems were better than what we'd had before, and I was building safeguards that should have existed from the beginning, but I'd been too trusting to implement. Caitlin called a meeting with me and the leadership team to present new HR policies she'd developed around transparency and reporting that would help catch warning signs earlier if anyone ever tried something like Derek's scheme again. She'd created an anonymous reporting system where employees could flag concerns about financial irregularities or unusual management behavior without fear of retaliation. The policies also required regular third-party audits and mandatory rotation of financial duties, so no single person controlled critical functions for extended periods. I approved everything she proposed and told her to roll it out company-wide with my full support. The employees seemed to appreciate the changes when Caitlin presented them at an all-hands meeting the following week, and several people told me privately that the new policies made them feel safer and more valued. The message was clear that we were learning from what happened and taking steps to prevent future betrayal, which helped rebuild trust that had been damaged. I made my first appointment with a therapist 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized because Connie insisted I needed professional help to process everything that had happened. I sat in the therapist's office feeling awkward and uncomfortable, talking about my feelings with a stranger, but I forced myself to be honest about the betrayal and the guilt I was carrying. The therapist asked why I felt guilty when Derek was the one who'd committed fraud and tried to steal the company, and I explained that I kept thinking I should have seen the signs earlier or been less trusting. She told me that Derek's choices were about his character flaws and his decision to betray our friendship, not my failure to predict that someone I'd known for 20 years would turn into a criminal. That perspective didn't immediately fix anything, but over the following weeks of sessions, it slowly started to ease the crushing guilt I'd been carrying around like a weight on my chest. The therapist helped me understand that trust isn't weakness, and that rebuilding my ability to trust people in business relationships would take time, but was possible. I started sleeping better after a few weeks of therapy, and Connie noticed I was less angry and more like myself again. Connie and I had a long conversation one evening about her role in the business going forward, and I told her I wanted to make her involvement official by bringing her on as a strategic advisor. She looked surprised and said she wasn't sure mixing business and marriage was a good idea, given how badly things could go wrong as we'd just witnessed with Derek and Angela. I reminded her that our partnership during the crisis had proved we worked incredibly well together, and that her investigative skills and strategic thinking had literally saved the company. She was quiet for a while thinking it over, and finally agreed to try it on a part-time basis to see how it affected our relationship. We set clear boundaries about keeping business discussions at the office and not letting work stress bleed into our home life more than necessary. Having Connie officially involved felt right after everything we'd been through together, and I trusted her judgment more than anyone else's at this point. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, the company had stabilized with 35 employees, and most of our major clients either retained or replaced with new contracts. We weren't back to where we'd been before Derek's betrayal with over 40 employees and several million in annual revenue, but we were profitable again, and the trajectory was positive. The culture felt stronger in some ways because everyone who'd stayed had proved their loyalty during the crisis, and we'd weeded out the people who were only there for a paycheck. I was working closely with Jennifer to rebuild our financial systems, and with Rachel to strengthen our operations, and both of them were exceeding my expectations in their new roles. Bruce told me one afternoon that the company felt more like a team now than it had in years, and I realized he was right that the crisis had forced us to pull together in ways we hadn't before. We still had a long way to go to fully recover from the damage Derek had caused, but we were moving in the right direction, and that was enough for now. I received an email from Derek's lawyer in early November saying Derek wanted to meet with me in person to apologize as part of his therapy process for dealing with the aftermath of everything that had happened. I stared at the email for a long time, feeling a complicated mix of anger and curiosity, and something that might have been residual affection for the friend I'd lost. I discussed it with Connie that evening, and she said it was completely my choice, but I should think carefully about whether seeing Derek would help or hurt my healing process. I brought it up in my next therapy session, and the therapist asked what I hoped to gain from the meeting and whether I thought Derek's apology would change anything about what he'd done. I realized I didn't want to see Derek because nothing he could say would undo the betrayal or restore the friendship we'd had, and I wasn't ready to offer him forgiveness he hadn't earned. I wrote back to Derek's lawyer declining the meeting and saying I wasn't ready for that conversation and might never be, which was my right to decide. Connie supported my decision completely and told me I didn't owe Derek anything, including the closure he was seeking for himself. Sebastian Ford called me in late November and told me he was referring 3 new clients to us because he was impressed by how we'd handled the crisis and rebuilt the company stronger than before. His continued faith in me after everything that had happened meant more than he probably knew, and I made sure to thank him properly for standing by us when he could have easily walked away. The 3 referrals were solid mid-size companies that would bring in good revenue and help fill the gap left by clients we'd lost during the dispute. I took Sebastian to lunch and told him his loyalty during the worst period of my professional life wouldn't be forgotten, and that I'd always prioritize his business because he'd proved what kind of person he was. He waved off my thanks and said he'd been in business long enough to know that character matters more than convenience, and he'd rather work with someone he trusted than chase the lowest bid. Those new clients helped stabilize our revenue and gave the team confidence that we were truly recovering. The business journal that had covered the partnership dispute ran a follow-up story in December about the resolution that was surprisingly favorable to me and the company. The article noted that we'd survived a serious partnership dispute and emerged with stronger controls and a loyal team that had been tested and proven. Several potential clients reached out after reading the article, asking about our services and saying they were impressed by how we'd handled the crisis professionally. I gave a brief interview for the story where I focused on lessons learned about the importance of proper oversight and not letting trust override good business practices. The positive coverage helped rebuild our reputation in the business community and showed that we weren't defined by Derek's betrayal, but by how we'd responded to it. The article ended up being better publicity than anything we could have paid for, and it marked a turning point where people stopped seeing us as the company with the partnership disaster and started seeing us as survivors who'd come out stronger. I booked a private room at the steakhouse downtown and invited Bruce, Caitlin, Rachel, and our new CFO to join me for dinner. The 5 of us sat around the table while servers brought out appetizers and drinks, and I could see everyone relaxing for the first time in months. Bruce ordered a bourbon and leaned back in his chair, telling a story about one of our early clients who used to pay invoices in cash because he didn't trust banks. Caitlin laughed and added her own memory about the time our old office flooded, and we spent a weekend moving files to my garage. Rachel looked around the table with this expression like she couldn't believe she was part of this group, and I made sure to include her in every conversation because she earned her place here. Jennifer, who joined us 2 months ago, listened to our stories and asked questions about the company's history, and I appreciated that she wanted to understand what we'd built together. When the main courses arrived, I raised my glass and told them I wanted to thank them properly for everything they did during the crisis. I said they could have walked away when things got ugly, but instead they stayed and fought alongside me, and that kind of loyalty means more than I can express. Bruce waved off my thanks and said we're a team, and teams stick together when things get hard. Caitlin added that she believed in what we were building and wasn't going to let one person's greed destroy it. Rachel got emotional and said she just did what was right, but I could see how much the recognition meant to her. We spent the next hour talking about lessons learned and how we wanted to move forward differently. Jennifer brought up the new financial controls we implemented and how they should prevent anyone from ever hiding money or making unilateral decisions again. Bruce suggested we create a leadership council that meets weekly to discuss major decisions, ensuring no single person has too much unchecked power. Caitlin talked about building a culture where employees feel safe reporting concerns without fear of retaliation, and I agreed that transparency has to be our foundation going forward. I admitted I'd been too trusting and too hands-off with the financial side, and that blind trust almost cost us everything. Rachel said she'd been scared to come forward at first because she didn't want to cause problems, but the experience taught her that staying silent about wrongdoing only makes things worse. We all acknowledged that what happened with Derek changed us, but we could use those changes to build something better and stronger. By the end of dinner, I felt genuinely hopeful about the company's future for the first time since this nightmare started. These people around the table proved themselves when it mattered most, and I knew I could trust them in ways I'd never trust anyone in business again. Connie called me the following Tuesday while I was reviewing quarterly reports and told me she'd heard from a mutual friend that Angela filed for divorce from Derek. I set down my pen and asked if she was sure, and Connie confirmed that the paperwork was filed last week and Angela moved out of their house over the weekend. I expected to feel satisfaction or vindication hearing that Derek's marriage fell apart along with everything else, but instead I just felt tired. Connie said she felt the same way, that there was no joy in watching someone's entire life collapse, even when they brought it on themselves. We talked about how Derek's choices didn't just destroy our partnership, but also wrecked his marriage, his relationship with his kids, and his reputation in the business community. Connie pointed out that Angela probably knew more about Derek's plans than she admitted during their coffee meeting, but being complicit in his scheme didn't protect her from the consequences. I wondered aloud if Derek ever considered what he was risking when he decided to betray me, whether he thought about his wife and children, and what would happen if his plan failed. Connie said some people convince themselves they're too smart to get caught, and Derek clearly believed his lawyer and his contract control made him untouchable. I told her I wasn't celebrating Derek's personal pain, because watching someone lose everything isn't satisfying, it's just sad and wasteful. She agreed and said we needed to focus on rebuilding our own lives rather than dwelling on Derek's destruction. I asked if she thought Angela would be okay financially, and Connie said she heard Angela's family was helping her, and she'd probably land on her feet eventually. We spent a few more minutes discussing the divorce before changing subjects to our own plans for the weekend. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about Derek's kids and how they'd process their father's downfall and their parents' divorce. Those kids used to call me uncle, and now they probably heard terrible things about me from Derek's side of the story. The whole situation felt like collateral damage spreading outward from Derek's original betrayal, hurting people who had nothing to do with the business dispute. Connie came into my office and put her hand on my shoulder, and I told her I was okay, just processing how many lives got damaged because one person got greedy. A young entrepreneur named Tyler reached out through a mutual connection, asking if I'd be willing to meet and discuss partnership structures for his startup. I agreed to coffee at a place near the office, and Tyler showed up with a notebook full of questions and this eager energy that reminded me of myself 20 years ago. He explained that he and his college friend were launching a tech consulting business and wanted to formalize their partnership agreement, but they weren't sure what protections they needed. I spent the next hour being brutally honest about everything I learned the hard way through Derek's betrayal. I told Tyler that friendship and business partnership are two different things, and treating them as the same almost cost me everything I built. He took notes while I explained the importance of clear operating agreements that specify each partner's roles, responsibilities, and limitations. I stressed that both partners need access to all financial information and that no single person should control the money without oversight. Tyler asked if having those protections meant they didn't trust each other, and I told him trust is important, but verification is essential. I explained that good partnership agreements aren't about assuming your partner will betray you. They're about creating structures that prevent misunderstandings and protect both parties. I walked him through specific clauses he should include about dispute resolution, buyout terms, and what happens if one partner wants to leave or gets forced out. Tyler looked overwhelmed by all the legal considerations, but I told him spending money on a good attorney now could save him from losing everything later. He asked about my experience with Derek and whether I saw warning signs I should have caught earlier. I admitted I missed a lot of red flags because I was too focused on trusting my friend instead of monitoring my business partner. I told Tyler that the hardest lesson I learned was that people can change over time, and the person you start a business with might not be the same person you're working with 10 years later. He asked how to protect against that kind of change, and I said you can't completely, but you can build systems that limit the damage one person can do. We talked about the importance of having an exit strategy from day one, even when everything feels great and the partnership seems solid. Tyler thanked me for the reality check and said he'd been hesitant to bring up legal protections with his friend because it felt pessimistic. I told him that protecting your business isn't pessimistic, it's responsible, and his friend should appreciate that he's thinking ahead. By the end of our meeting, Tyler had pages of notes and a much clearer understanding of what he needed to do before formalizing his partnership. He shook my hand and said he hoped he never needed to use these protections, but he was grateful to know what to put in place. I watched him leave and felt good about potentially saving someone else from the experience I went through. 6 months after my confrontation with Derek in the conference room, I found myself going through old boxes in our garage looking for tax documents. I came across a photo album Connie made years ago documenting the company's growth, and I sat down on the concrete floor and started flipping through pages. There were pictures of Derek and me at our first office, both of us looking so young and confident and full of plans. Photos from company parties where we stood together with employees who trusted us both. Images of us shaking hands with clients, celebrating contract signings, cutting the ribbon at our current office building. I expected looking at these photos to trigger rage or that crushing sadness that used to hit me whenever I thought about our friendship. Instead, I felt something more manageable, a dull ache that acknowledged the loss without consuming me completely. The grief was still there, but it didn't have the same power over me anymore. I studied Derek's face in these old photos and tried to figure out when things changed, when my friend became someone capable of systematic betrayal. Maybe he was always that person, and I just couldn't see it because I didn't want to. Maybe the Derek I thought I knew never really existed, just my idealized version of a friendship that meant more to me than it did to him. I closed the album and sat there in the garage thinking about how I'd spent months mourning a relationship that was probably never as real as I believed. The friend I thought I had, the brother I trusted completely, that person might have been my own creation rather than who Derek actually was. It hurt to accept that possibility, but it hurt less than continuing to grieve someone who never existed. Connie came into the garage and found me sitting there with the photo album, and she sat down next to me without saying anything. I told her I was okay, that I was finally able to look at these pictures without feeling destroyed. She asked if I wanted to keep the album or throw it away, and I said I'd keep it because it's part of my history, even if that history turned out differently than I thought. We sat together for a while longer before I put the album back in its box and stood up. The memories didn't have the same hold on me anymore, and while I'd never forget what happened, I could finally move forward without constantly looking back. Our business development team landed a contract with a manufacturing company that was bigger than anything we'd handled before. The client, a national operation with facilities in 12 states, wanted us to overhaul their entire supply chain management system. Bruce came into my office with the signed contract and this huge grin on his face, and I stood up and shook his hand before calling the whole team together. Everyone gathered in the main conference room, and I announced the new client, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. This wasn't just a good contract, it was validation that we'd not only survived Derek's betrayal, but were actually growing beyond where we were before. Rachel hugged Caitlin and Jennifer raised her fist in celebration, and Bruce started talking about the team we'd need to assemble for the project. I looked around the room at these people who'd stayed loyal during the worst period of our company's history, and I felt genuine pride in what we'd accomplished together. Someone suggested we celebrate properly, so we ordered pizza and beer for the office and spent the afternoon talking about the new project and what it meant for our future. Bruce pulled me aside at one point and said this contract proved we were more than just the company that survived a partnership dispute. He said clients were choosing us now because of our expertise and our reputation for delivering results, not despite what happened with Derek. I told him this felt like a real turning point, the moment where we stopped recovering from the past and started building towards something better. Caitlin added that the team's confidence had been growing steadily, but this contract would boost morale even more. Jennifer mentioned that the revenue from this client would let us hire 2 more people and invest in some technology upgrades we'd been postponing. We spent the rest of the day planning the project timeline and discussing how we'd structure the team to handle such a large client. By the time everyone left that evening, I felt more optimistic about the company's future than I had in over a year. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were actually thriving, and that meant everything after how close we came to losing it all. I attended a regional business conference where several of our clients and competitors were presenting, and I ran into Gerald Whitman during a break between sessions. Gerald had been one of Derek's allies during the dispute, someone who publicly supported Derek's version of events before the truth came out. He saw me across the lobby, and his expression went from recognition to discomfort. But he walked over anyway and tried to make small talk about the conference speakers. I responded politely, but kept my answers brief, and there was this awkward tension hanging between us that neither of us acknowledged directly. Gerald asked how the company was doing, and I said we were doing well and growing beyond where we were before. He nodded and said he'd heard good things about our recent work, and I thanked him without adding anything else. He stood there for a moment like he wanted to say something more, maybe apologize for siding with Derek or explain why he did it. But I didn't give him an opening. I'd learned that some bridges aren't worth rebuilding, that not every relationship needs to be salvaged or explained. Gerald finally said it was good to see me and walked away, and I felt completely at peace with letting him go. There was a time when I would have wanted to confront him or demand an explanation for why he believed Derek's lies over my track record. Now I understood that his choice to side with Derek told me everything I needed to know about his character and judgment. I didn't need his apology or his friendship, and I wasn't interested in pretending we could go back to some professional courtesy we had before. The conference continued, and I focused on the sessions and networking with people who'd proven themselves trustworthy. Later that day, someone asked me about Gerald and whether we'd patch things up, and I said we'd spoken briefly, but I wasn't interested in rebuilding that relationship. They seemed surprised that I was so matter-of-fact about it, but I explained that the crisis taught me to value loyalty and integrity over convenience. Some people proved who they were during the dispute, and I was choosing to invest my time and energy in relationships with people who'd earned my trust. Walking away from Gerald without anger or resentment felt like another step forward in my recovery from everything that happened with Derek. Bruce stopped by my office late on a Thursday afternoon and closed the door behind him, which usually meant he had something serious to discuss. He sat down and told me he'd been approached by 2 different competitors in the past month, trying to recruit him away from our company. I felt my stomach drop because losing Bruce would be devastating after everything we'd been through together. He must have seen my expression because he quickly added that he turned both offers down and wanted me to know he was staying. I asked him what they offered, and he said both companies promised higher salary, better titles, and leadership roles that would advance his career faster. I told him I'd understand if he wanted to take one of those opportunities because I couldn't blame anyone for pursuing their own growth. Bruce leaned forward and said he appreciated that, but he was staying because he believed in what we were building and valued the culture we'd created together. He said working somewhere with better pay but worse values wouldn't make him happy, and he'd rather build something meaningful with people he trusted. I felt this wave of gratitude and told him his loyalty meant more to me than he probably knew. Bruce said Derek's betrayal was devastating, but it also revealed who the real team players were, and he was proud to be part of the group that stayed and fought. We talked about his career development, and I promised to create more opportunities for him to grow and take on leadership responsibilities. I told him I wanted to make sure staying with us didn't limit his professional advancement, and we'd work together to build a path that challenged him and utilized his skills. Bruce said he appreciated that, and he knew I'd support his growth because I'd already proven I cared about my people. We spent another hour discussing his ideas for the company and how we could implement some of his suggestions for improving operations. By the time he left my office, I felt deeply grateful that Derek's betrayal, while devastating in so many ways, had shown me exactly who my real allies were. Bruce could have left when things got hard or taken one of these better offers when they came, but he chose to stay because he valued what we were building together. That kind of loyalty is rare and precious, and I made a mental note to make sure Bruce knew how much I valued him, not just with words, but with actions and opportunities. We held the company's 16th anniversary party on a Friday evening at a nice venue downtown, and I made sure to invite all our employees plus key clients who'd stayed loyal during the crisis. The room filled up with people talking and laughing, and I stood near the entrance, greeting everyone as they arrived. Sebastian Ford showed up early and gave me a firm handshake, telling me he wouldn't have missed this celebration for anything. Several other clients came through and congratulated me on not just surviving the partnership dispute, but coming out stronger. The employees mingled with clients, and I could see the pride they felt in being part of this company and this team. Rachel had helped organize the event, and she'd done an amazing job with the decorations and the catering, creating an atmosphere that felt both professional and genuinely celebratory. Around 7 o'clock, I stepped up to the microphone and asked for everyone's attention. I looked around the room at all these faces, some who'd been with us from the beginning, and others who joined more recently, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. I started my speech by acknowledging that this had been the hardest year in our company's history, and I thanked everyone who stood by us during the crisis. I said their loyalty and dedication meant everything, and I wanted them to know I'd never forget who stayed when things got difficult. I talked about how we'd rebuilt the company with better systems, stronger values, and a renewed commitment to transparency and trust. I acknowledged that we'd lost some people along the way, but the team we had now was stronger and more united than ever before. Several people in the crowd nodded, and a few employees wiped their eyes, and I could feel the emotion in the room. I said this anniversary felt different from previous ones because we weren't just celebrating another year in business. We were celebrating survival and resilience and the power of standing together. I raised my glass and proposed a toast to everyone in the room, to their loyalty and their hard work and their belief in what we were building together. The room erupted in applause, and people clinked glasses, and I stepped down from the microphone feeling like we'd truly turned a corner. The party continued for several more hours with music and dancing and conversations that felt genuinely warm and connected. Bruce found me later in the evening and said this felt like the first time since the crisis started that everyone could truly relax and celebrate. I agreed and told him it felt like we were finally moving forward instead of constantly looking back at what happened with Derek. By the end of the night, I drove home feeling hopeful about the future and grateful for the people who'd proven themselves when it mattered most. I called Rachel into my office on Monday morning and asked her to close the door and have a seat. She looked nervous, probably worried she'd done something wrong, but I smiled and told her this was good news. I explained that I'd been thinking a lot about her courage in exposing Derek's scheme and how she risked her job and her security to do the right thing. I said that kind of integrity deserved more than just verbal thanks, so I'd established a college fund for her kids that would cover their tuition when they were ready for university. Rachel's eyes went wide, and she started shaking her head, saying that was too much, and she didn't expect anything like that. I told her she just did what was right, but doing the right thing when it's difficult and scary deserves recognition. She started crying and tried to talk but couldn't get the words out, and I handed her a tissue and gave her a moment to compose herself. When she could finally speak, she said she'd been terrified to come forward because she thought it might cost her everything. I told her that her decision to speak up saved the company and protected everyone's jobs, and that was worth recognizing in a meaningful way. Rachel stood up and came around the desk and hugged me, still crying, and I hugged her back and told her she'd earned every bit of this. She pulled back and wiped her eyes and said she couldn't believe I'd do something this generous. I explained that I wanted her to know that doing the right thing has consequences worth recognizing, and I hoped this would help her kids have opportunities they might not have had otherwise. Rachel sat back down, and we talked about the fun details and how it would work when her kids were ready for college. She kept thanking me, and I kept telling her she'd earned it, and by the end of our conversation, she seemed to finally accept that I meant every word. After she left my office, I sat there feeling good about the decision because Rachel's courage had literally saved everything I'd built, and making sure her kids had educational opportunities felt like the least I could do. Connie agreed when I told her about it that evening, saying Rachel deserved recognition that went beyond words and bonuses. The fund was set up through our attorney to ensure it would be there when Rachel's kids needed it, and knowing I could do something meaningful for someone who'd proven their integrity during the worst crisis of my professional life brought me genuine satisfaction. I made dinner reservations at the small Italian place where Connie and I had our first date 20 years ago. The same red tablecloths covered the tables and the same family photos hung on the walls, and when we sat down in a corner booth, she reached across and took my hand without saying anything. We ordered wine and pasta, and for the first few minutes we just sat there looking at each other, both of us knowing we needed to talk about everything that happened, but not sure where to start. I finally broke the silence by telling her I couldn't have survived the past 9 months without her, that her strength and clear thinking saved not just the business, but probably me too. She squeezed my hand and said, "We're partners in everything, not just marriage," and she was proud of how I fought for what we built while staying true to myself, even when it would have been easier to give up. We talked about how the crisis changed us, how I learned I can't just trust people blindly, even when they've been in my life for years, and how she discovered she's stronger and more capable than she ever gave herself credit for. I admitted I wished it hadn't happened. That part of me still mourns the friendship I thought I had with Derek, but I'm grateful for what the experience taught me about real loyalty and who actually has my back when things get hard. Connie said she feels the same way, that losing Derek and Angela from our lives hurt, but it showed us who our real family is, and those relationships matter more now because they were tested and proved genuine. We finished our wine and ordered dessert, and by the end of the night I felt lighter than I had in months, like we were finally moving forward instead of constantly looking back at the betrayal and all the damage Derek caused. 3 weeks later, I was having coffee with Sebastian when he mentioned he'd heard through business contacts that Derek's new company had completely failed. I felt my stomach tighten and asked what happened, and Sebastian explained that Derek couldn't deliver on his promises without my operational knowledge, and the clients started leaving one by one until there was nothing left. He said Derek tried to keep it going for about 6 months, but eventually had to shut down and take a junior position at a competitor's firm, working for someone else after being a partner for 15 years. I sat there processing this information and waiting to feel something, maybe satisfaction or vindication, but mostly I just felt empty and a little sad that it came to this. When I told my therapist about it during our next session, she asked how I felt hearing the news, and I admitted I felt almost nothing, which seemed strange given how much anger I'd carried for months. She smiled and said that feeling nothing is actually healthy progress, that it means I've processed the betrayal and moved on emotionally, and Derek's failure or success doesn't define my worth or happiness anymore. I drove home thinking about how different this reaction was from the rage I felt 9 months ago, and I realized I'd finally let go of needing Derek to suffer for what he did, because his choices already cost him everything that mattered. The new CFO I hired, Jennifer, implemented financial systems that gave me complete visibility into every aspect of company finances. She set up weekly reports showing cash flow, client billing, vendor payments, and account balances, all organized in dashboards I could access anytime from my phone or computer. I sat through the first training session feeling embarrassed that I'd never insisted on this level of transparency before, that I'd let Derek control all the financial details for 15 years without ever looking over his shoulder. Jennifer was professional about it and never made me feel stupid, just walked me through each system and explained what the numbers meant and what warning signs to watch for. I started attending monthly financial review meetings and asking questions about things I didn't understand, forcing myself to learn the details I'd always avoided because I trusted Derek to handle it. Bruce commented one day that I seemed more engaged with the business side of operations, and I told him I learned the hard way that blind trust, even with partners you've known for years, is stupid and dangerous. The systems Jennifer put in place would have caught Derek's scheme within weeks instead of months, would have shown me the money he was moving and the duplicate accounts he was setting up, and knowing I have that protection now helps me sleep better at night. On a Saturday morning when Connie was visiting her sister, I drove across town to the old neighborhood where Derek and I started the company 16 years ago. The basement apartment where we made those first cold calls and split pizzas because we couldn't afford our own had been renovated, with new windows and a fresh coat of paint on the exterior walls. I parked across the street and sat in my car looking at the building, letting myself remember the good parts of our partnership before everything went wrong. I remembered Derek staying up until 3 in the morning helping me prepare a pitch for our first major client, remembered him lending me money when Connie and I couldn't make rent one month, remembered celebrating together when we signed our 10th employee and realized we were actually building something real. Those memories hurt now because they feel tainted by what came after, but sitting there in my car, I tried to separate the person Derek was then from the person he became. Tried to accept that maybe both versions were real, and I'll never fully understand what changed. I said goodbye out loud to that version of our friendship, acknowledged that it's gone forever, and I need to stop looking for it in old photos or shared memories. When I drove away 20 minutes later, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of peace I hadn't expected, like I'd finally closed a door that needed closing. 9 months after Derek's exit, the company was not just surviving but actually doing better than before in some ways. We had 38 employees, 3 fewer than our peak, but all of them proven loyal and committed to the culture we were building. Client relationships were strong with several major accounts that trusted us more because of how we handled the crisis, and we'd landed 2 new contracts that were bigger than anything we had before Derek left. The financial systems Jennifer implemented meant I could see problems coming before they became disasters, and the leadership team I'd built with Bruce, Rachel, and the others worked together better than the old structure ever did. I'd learned to balance trust with verification, to value loyalty without being blind to warning signs that something's wrong, and to appreciate the people who proved themselves when it mattered most. The company had better legal protections now, with partnership agreements and financial controls that would prevent anyone from trying what Derek attempted. I still carried scars from the betrayal, still had moments where I questioned my judgment about people, but I was building something better with a team I could actually trust. Connie brought up the idea of renewing our wedding vows one evening while we were making dinner together. She said the crisis made our marriage stronger in ways she didn't expect, that working together to save the company showed her we could survive anything as long as we stayed united. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at her, feeling my throat get tight, and told her I loved that idea and wanted to celebrate what we'd built together through everything that happened. We started planning a small ceremony for our backyard with just the people who mattered most, the core team who stood by us when they could have walked away. I wanted Bruce there because his loyalty never wavered, and Rachel because her courage started everything, and Jennifer because she helped rebuild what Derek tried to destroy. Connie suggested inviting Sebastian and a few other clients who proved their friendship went beyond business relationships, and I agreed because they're family now in ways that matter more than blood or old friendships. Life wasn't perfect, and I still had bad days where Derek's betrayal hit me harder than others, but I was building something better with people I could actually trust. The scars would always be there reminding me to be careful, but they also reminded me what real loyalty looks like and how much stronger Connie and I became by surviving the worst thing that could have happened to us. That felt like the best possible outcome from a situation that almost destroyed everything.